Welcome to the Digital Download by Hebs Digital. Today, we will focus on the General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR, which is quickly approaching. During today's digital download around GDPR, we will be covering what is GDPR and why is it important, some myths and top things you need to know, and we'll conclude with an action plan for hoteliers. But before we kick it off, please note that this webinar is for informational purposes only. Hotels should be working with their legal advisors on how GDPR impacts your specific hotel and business.
Today's discussion will be led by Jackie Maloney, Head of Project Management at Hebs Digital, and myself, Garrick Lee, Marketing Manager at Hebs Digital.
So let's start with the most basic question. What is GDPR? The General Data Protection Regulation is a rule for how companies manage and share personal data. GDPR was passed by the European Union in 2016 and is set to take effect on May 25, 2018. While the GDPR only applies to EU residents' data, the global nature of the Internet means that nearly every online service is affected, and the regulation has already resulted in significant changes for US users as companies begin to adapt. And why is GDPR important? GDPR expands upon the existing privacy regulations of the EU. One of the most critical elements is the expanded concept of explicit and informed consent. The GDPR sets a higher standard for collecting personal data than ever before. It also expands the definition around what constitutes personal data, such as location data or an identification number. A company needs to provide one of 6 legal bases in order to obtain or process personal data. One of the most common bases for marketing to customers will be through obtaining explicit and informed consent from that person. Additionally, once consent is given, the person must be able to revoke that consent, as well as have the right to access that information. This is important for all companies who provide business with or market to EU residents. Even if the company is located outside the EU, the GDPR expands the territorial scope to include processes that take place of data subjects who are in the European Union. The penalties for non-compliance are severe and consist of 2 tiers of fines. The maximum fines per violation are set at up to 4% of a company's annual global revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is larger. The lower level fines are up to 2% of a company's annual global revenue or 10 million euros, whichever is larger. These penalties far exceed fines allowed by the Data Protection Directive, and it signals how serious the EU is taking data privacy. Now that you have some background information into what GDPR is and why it is important, we will go through some GDPR facts and clear up some common misconceptions. The first important fact is that GDPR applies to all properties that target EU residents as customers, no matter where the hotel is located. This means that GDPR affects all hotels in the US and located around the world, not just Europe. The second fact is that hotels are liable for GDPR. Regardless of your partner or solution provider, the hotel, who according to the GDPR would be considered the data controller, is ultimately responsible for using tools that are in compliance with the GDPR. And the last important fact, which is commonly overlooked, is that there needs to be one price point for all of the EU. Hotels cannot set prices based on an EU visitor's country of location. In this next section, we will cover the top 5 things hoteliers need to know. The first principle we will cover speaks about the rights of the data subject. The rules are centered around lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. When relying on consent for processing personal data, EU residents must give explicit consent and be given transparency into why the data is being collected. The data must be collected for a specific and predefined purpose that is clearly communicated to each individual prior to that user giving consent. Additionally, all EU individuals have the right to be forgotten. The user can access their data, ask for all of their data to be deleted across an organization, and request a copy of the data in a commonly used format. It is the data controller's responsibility to provide this information within a month of receipt of this request. The second principle is accuracy and purpose limitation. The accuracy principle mandates that all personal data must be accurate and kept up to date. It gives individuals the right to request that inaccurate information be corrected. The purpose limitation principle instructs that personal data can only be processed for its initial intended purpose. Further processing of the collected data is prohibited without renewed consent from the individual. The third principle focuses on data minimization and storage limitation. The GDPR introduces the concept of privacy by design and by default. The goal of this concept is for companies to integrate data protection and privacy controls into the development lifecycle of new business processes, applications, and services that touch personal data. The data minimization principle states that only the personal data that is absolutely necessary should be collected. Companies should refrain from collecting extra information about the user that is not needed. And further, the storage limitation principle mandates that personal data must be stored for no longer than is required, and that individuals must be informed about the planned retention period for their personal data. Companies will want to put in place a data retention policy and ensure it is being followed by all teams. The fourth principle focuses on integrity and confidentiality, which states that data should be protected appropriately and should be rendered anonymous where possible. This anonymization ensures that EU residents can no longer be identified by the data. Article 25 of the GDPR mandates that data controllers, such as the hotel, implement appropriate technical and organizational controls to safeguard the processing of any personal data that cannot be made anonymous. The effectiveness of these controls must be measured and documented on a regular basis. And the last principle we will cover today is centered around accountability. Data protection authorities govern adherence to regulation. Any organization processing personal data of EU residents must be able to give evidence to demonstrate compliance. Data breaches also receive particular attention under the GDPR. Each company should have a policy in place to handle potential data breaches. Each incident must be reported to the appropriate authority within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. If the breach has a high risk of adversely affecting individuals' rights and freedoms, you must also inform those individuals without undue delay. The onus is on the organization to continuously monitor, review, and enhance controls to limit and secure the processing of personal data. The responsibility doesn't fall fully on controllers. Under the regulation, data processors are also responsible for maintaining the privacy and confidentiality of personal data and for reporting any breaches to the data controller without undue delay.
Now that Jackie has covered some principles around GDPR, I will take you through a hotelier's action plan on how to prepare for it. This action plan can be broken down into three strategic focuses. First, your website, then your data, and then lastly, your marketing. First and foremost, you need to update your website's privacy policy. Your hotel website's privacy policy and terms and conditions should be updated to reference GDPR rules and regulations, making it transparent what you will do with personal information once you've collected it and how long you'll retain this information both on your website and in other databases. To ensure website security, this one should already hopefully be checked off, especially given Google's favorable ranking toward secure sites. But you must have an SSL certificate on your website to follow GDPR regulations. An SSL certificate is to ensure that all data processing through the website is secure. If you aren't sure if you have this or not, take a look at your website address. If it starts with HTTPS followed by some slashes and then the www, you are good to go. If not, definitely reach out to your IT team to see if something like this can be implemented for your specific domain. For those of you who are in the EU or who have visited other hotel websites located in the EU, you may have noticed these types of functionalities already. But all websites must have a cookie consent present upon opt-in for all website visitors. Also, if your consent is in the way of a form, you cannot have boxes pre-checked off for cookie consent. This is against GDPR regulations. For email opt-in, this one is fairly simple, so that's great news. If you have an email sign-up form or something similar, update the opt-in form so that there are no pre-checked boxes. This is also against GDPR regulations. The last note about website forms is that you must clearly state where the entered information is going to be stored. So for example, if a hotel website uses Cvent's Speed RFP tool for their website, they will need to have that clearly identified and explained on the page so that the user knows where their information is going to and where it's going to be stored. Now moving into data. So a lot of different rules are being put in place for data, especially for those in the EU, those being the users. And it's going to be really important to make sure that people have the ability to access their data and then append their data. Hotels need to be able to provide this information to users upon request and then allow them to make any edits to the information that hotels have on them in their databases. Further, companies cannot keep data for longer than what is required. We recommend reviewing databases every 6 months to keep records accurate and relevant, and definitely take a extra step and the extra measure before May 25th just to review the data and make sure that everything looks good. For the right to be forgotten, there's the GDPR regulation where a user has the ability to request to have their information removed from all databases of this particular company. One way of having this be available to users is by having a request form on the website so that users can submit a request to have their information deleted. Shifting into marketing, all the boxes as it relates to this are pretty straightforward, but for marketing purposes, which we all do as businesses, we need to make it explicit as to which ad networks we are working with and what different types of companies will have access to a user's data upon visiting a website or opting into a particular database. For vendor clarity, this should be explicitly explained in a couple different sections of your website, especially in the privacy policy. Marketing is something that cannot be stopped, especially if we want to continue making money. For vendor compliance, your marketing agency or internal marketing department should reach out to any third-party vendors or ad networks to make sure that they are GDPR compliant and have taken the appropriate measures to follow GDPR regulations. Because at the end of the day, we as marketers may have to stop working with certain vendors for the time being until they are GDPR compliant, especially since we as the company marketing to the individuals are the reliable party. Lastly, you should not only keep your data clean, but also use the data as it was intended. That means that you cannot have someone who opted in for retargeting, but then also use that data to build lookalike audiences. By breaking this rule, it means that you're violating GDPR. We hope that you found all this information informative. We definitely tried our best to make it clear and have actionable things that you need to take as hoteliers and hospitality professionals especially in this new world of GDPR where there's a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of misconceptions, but we hope that this was pretty straightforward. But if you have any additional questions, definitely reach out to dataprivacy@hebsdigital.com for more information. You can also look at our website, hebsdigital.com/GDPR, to access our white paper and other great materials like a checklist and a list of terms you need to know. And as earlier noted, please note that this webinar is for informational purposes only. Hotels should definitely be working with their legal advisors on how GDPR impacts your specific hotel and business. Thank you so much for joining.